I have a memory. I don't actually have a lot of memories. My wife always thinks there's something wrong with me because she said, "Remember that? No. You remember that? No." I don't know. I just have a deficient memory. But I do have one early memory, and I remember when I was very little, I was walking behind my father, and my father was kind of walking a little bit duck-footed like this. And so I wanted to be like my father, so I was following my father with my feet kind of out like this. And my mother was right next to me, and she poked me in the back and said, so my father didn't hear her, "You don't walk like that. Keep your feet straight, or you're going to end up walking like that." I wanted to be like my dad, and so I was kind of imitating something that probably wouldn't have been good for my bone structure over time. And then I have another memory when I was at the Air Force Academy. There were some guys on the football team I really liked. They were really witty and cool, and I always kind of wished I could be like that. And I remember there was one big lecture hall. There's a big lecture hall, and I was being really a wise guy, and I was trying to be witty and stuff, and I really wasn't. And I remember the professor looked at me in this big, and he really reprimanded me. And I remember feeling not only humiliated and embarrassed. Fortunately, I didn't get demerits for that. But again, I wanted to be, I want to be like these guys. I want to really fit in. Wish I could do that. So I was being kind of obnoxious in that. And we're social beings, and as social beings, we want to be like people, right? We want to be like someone or some group or something. It kind of comes with the territory. We want to be like people. And it's not only us individually, but small groups, larger groups, even nations can want to be like others. And it's not always a good thing. Who we want to be like is very, very important. And so in our story this morning in the book of 1 Samuel, we find this very interesting story of Israel wanting to be like the other nations. Now, we need to understand, just to give just a quick context for this, if you remember, Moses led Israel out of Egypt. They were enslaved. He led them out, so he was their leader. Moses actually never entered the promised land. It was Joshua who took them into the promised land to start conquering and make it their home. And so after that, then, there's a period, there's actually after the book of Joshua, there's called the book of Judges, and it's about the history of Israel with their judges. The judges were not kings. They were appointed. They kind of rose up. Israel was like a loose confederation, and when they needed a leader, one would rise. You probably heard of Samson was one of the judges. There was a woman judge, Deborah. There's Barak, who was a judge. And Samuel was the last judge, was the judge that this story is about right now. And so some of the judges were good, some were not so good. Samuel was a good judge, but it turns out he was kind of using his sons as well, and his sons were really out of control. They were corrupt, and the people didn't like them. So at one point, then, the elders of Israel come to Samuel, and they say, "We want a king. We don't want judges. We want a king. We want to be like other nations. We want the king to rule over us." There were constant battles, and the Philistines at this point were settling and were a major enemy and opponent for them. And so I think they had in mind they wanted a king to lead them into war. We want to be like the other nations. We don't want to be what we're doing right now. We don't like the way things are operating. Clearly, the scriptures tell us Samuel's upset. He's taking it personally, and as he prays, God says to him, "Actually, Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they are rejecting me as king." And he says, "Do what they say, but you need to give them a warning of what's going to happen if they become like the other nations and they get a king." And the first king, by the way, was King Saul. And so Samuel does, and in our text this morning, our Old Testament lesson, he tells the people what's going to happen. And there are 6 times that Samuel tells them he's going to take away this, he's going to take away this, he's going to take away this. and it's not going to go good for you. But they don't care, and they say this, no, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, I suspect that one of the reasons they were motivated was out of fear, because they wanted to feel more protected. They thought if they had a king and an army, things would go a lot better. So I think one of the deep motivations in order to do this, to get a king, was out of fear. And so God then relents, and he says, okay, if you want a king, I will give you a king. And from that point on, Samuel anoints Saul, and then there's a series of kings in Israel. Now, I want to go back and make some observations about this. First of all, it's very important to know that Israel had a covenant relationship with God. They weren't supposed to be like the other nations. They had a special relationship with God. God chose them out of all the nations of the world to be in this special relationship with him. And in Leviticus 11:45 it says, "For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God, and you shall be holy, for I am holy." Now I want to come back to this word holy and spend more time on it, but for right now, these people that God was choosing were to be a special people dedicated to him. If you think of the promise that God gave to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. He said, you're going to be a blessing to all the world. I'm choosing you. And God tells him in Deuteronomy, he says, it's not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set his heart on you and chose you. You were the fewest of all people. God didn't choose Israel because there was something they deserved to be chosen. It was out of God's sheer gracious choice that he chose this nation that really was not a big nation. They didn't have anything going for it. They weren't on the front lines. They weren't on the top of the nation pyramid. He just chose them, this nation, and he chose them so they would be an example, so other nations would look around and see what it was really supposed to be like, how this nation would interact with their God. And so through that, they would bless all the other rest of the world would be blessed. Other nations would see the kind of relationship they have with God, and that they would then want to follow. So it's very important to understand that this really was at the heart of what God was doing. So there is a way when they say, well, we want to be like the other nations, they are actually contradicting the way God wanted that relationship to be, because they were to be kind of this city on a hill. They were supposed to be an example to the other nations in terms of what it's really like to live a life of love and faithfulness with one another and honesty and treating the poor. They were to be an illustration and an example of that. So they really were rejecting God as king. Which brings me to the word holy. Now this word holy, I think, has gotten bad press and is misunderstood. If someone says to you, oh, you're really holy, I don't think most of us would take that as a compliment, right? If I said, boy, you're really holy. I think the word holy and holiness has the connotation, maybe you're kind of a goody two-shoes, lots of do's and don'ts, maybe kind of rigid, joyless. So my guess is the adjective is to say someone is holy. I don't think people are dying to have that label put with them, that adjective used about them. You're a holy person. But really, again, the word holy, when you look it up in the dictionary, means dedicated or consecrated to God. Holy is dedicated and consecrated to God, which is exactly what Israel was supposed to be. That was what they were called to do. Now, when holiness does involve don'ts. Don't do this, don't do that. But the don'ts are always in service of the do's. What do I mean by that? The very core of who we are to be devoted to God. We are to be devoted to God. And so when you're devoted to someone or something, you do those things that enhance the relationship, right? You become that kind of person that will really make that relationship and the person that you're devoted to pleased, and you stay away from those things that will detract from the relationship, those things that will be destructive to the relationship. So the emphasis, I think, tends to be, I think, focused on the negative, the way the common usage of the word holy has come to mean, but really it's on the positive. We are devoted to God. Israel, you're devoted to God, so as you're devoted to God, these are things you're going to do, and these are things you're going to need to stay away from, so that you really please me and you become a light to the world. I think it's really important that we understand how those things work together. Now, the other interesting thing about this passage, if you think about Israel, what were they? They were taken out of Egypt as slaves, and Moses takes them out. They finally get their land, and as they ask for a king, it's very interesting. In verse 17, Samuel says, he ends up with he'll take. He says this, he will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. So in their desire to be like the other nations, in their desire to be free, Samuel is telling them, you are going to go back into a different kind of slavery. You are not going to be free. He's going to take, he's going to take, he's going to take, and you are going to be slaves again. Now, what does that all have to do with you and me? Well, I think it's very, very important that we understand that we are part of Israel. In 1 Peter, in the epistle lesson this morning, which Lisa read, Peter is talking to the church, and he says this, you must be holy in every aspect of your lives, just as the one who called you is holy. It is written, you will be holy because I am holy. And he's quoting Leviticus 11:45. In Psalm 81:11 and 12, again, the psalmist says, but my people did not listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me, so I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsel. Peter is saying, this applies to us. We are to be holy because God is holy. We have a king. Who's our king? This is a responsive part of the sermon. Who's our king? And Jesus particularly. Like Scott McKnight talked about the King Jesus gospel. We have a king. And so we are called, being called to be living holy lives means devoting our lives to Jesus and living our lives by God's grace, living into that in terms of spiritual formation in ways that are pleasing to God and that enhance the relationship, in ways that are obvious to other people. And if we live that way, we are going to stand out. We are not always going to fit in. And so we are called to be devoted to God, to be devoted to Jesus. We are called to live differently so that we will stand out. Sometimes that may make us uncomfortable. How do we speak? What words do we use? How do we talk with one another? How do we handle money? What is our behavior sexually? How do we interact with the poor? All of these are implications of being devoted to God, being devoted to Jesus and following King Jesus. And so at times then we will stand out. People may not like that, but we are to be a sign, and we are to instantiate. We are to live the way God wants us to live. Mahatma Gandhi, I'm sure you're familiar with him, he looked closely at Christianity, especially when he was living in Great Britain. And he remarked that if only Christians would live according to their belief in the teachings of Jesus, quote, we all would become Christians. He's also the one that said, I love your Christ, I don't love your Christians. And that, I think, is because of the gap between our King and the way our King wants us to live and the way we actually do live. And the way actually we do live our lives. We bring dishonor to God when we aren't on the journey by the power of the Holy Spirit, devoting ourselves to Christ and to being that kind of person Christ calls us to be. What is our behavior like in the world? What do people see when we're at work, when we're at parties, when we're on the athletic field, the way we talk to one another? What do people see? Do they see Jesus shining through us, or do they see us like other people? Do they see us not responding the way God has called us to respond and to be? And so I want to leave you with a couple questions. The first question is this: who do you want to be like? And another way of saying that is, to whom or to what are you devoted? I think that's a very important question to ask ourselves. Who do I really want to be like, and to whom am I devoted? And then, does my life reflect my behavior, my speech, the way I treat others? Does my behavior and my speech and my actions reflect the person to whom I say I am devoted? Because if we call ourselves disciples, a disciple is someone who has said, yes, I am devoted to Jesus. He's the center of my life. He's the core of all I'm going to be doing. And by God's grace, and again, it takes grace. We can't do this on our own. I am going to become like that person. He is going to be my King. I am going to honor him in my life and everything I do and say. I think his word to us is found in 1 Peter. He says to us, as he who called you is holy, be holy in your conduct. For it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Amen.